Hey everyone, Paul here, how's it going? In this tutorial, I am going to take you through Freestyle. It's still relevant. It's in 2.80, it works great, and everything I'm going to show you will work in 2.79. I will point out one area in which there's a slight difference in label, but besides that label difference, everything else is going to function just the same. I'm working in 2.8 beta, the latest release that came out maybe a day ago. I've used Freestyle for many years now, and I've found it to be a very useful tool. I'm going to point out a few things about Freestyle, what you need to know going in, what to expect, and the best practices for setting it up for a render. Now, what you're seeing here is basically just a freestyle pass over a white background. And the way I've set this up, if I take a look here at my compositor, I've got one render layer with the freestyle rendered out, and I've run it through a color mix node into the second slot, and I've just put white as the base color, and this basically gives us the line pass over white so that we can basically just get some line work out of Blender. And this is what I'm going to take you through today. So it's going to be a nice quick tutorial just to really nail down what we need to do. Okay, so we've got a few settings here in Freestyle. They all look a little bit complex. I mean, what's a line set? What's this selection by? What's the edge types? What's the line style got to do with anything? And what are all these little things that say stroke and thickness and whatnot? And what happens when you add modifiers, and what do the modifiers do? Well, I'm going to cover all of that today. And so without any further ado, why don't we jump in and take a look at the starting file. I've provided this modified model from a comic that I did a couple years back. And I'm going to assume that you've just opened up Blender and you want to sort of set this up to render out line pass. So what have we got? Well, if you're in 2.80, by default, your render engine might be set to Eevee. I highly recommend you switch that over to cycles. All right. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is go down to sampling. I'm going to type in 4 and 4 because we don't need a lot of samples. Freestyle is kind of independent to the physics-based rendering, which means we're going to get some fairly fast renders. Under light paths, this is the other thing. So total, you could probably bump that down to 4. In our case, I don't need any transmission or transparency, or even glossy for that matter, but I'm just going to leave diffuse and glossy there. And then I'm going to untick under caustics, reflective caustics and refractive caustics. What this does is it just speeds up the render process so that Blender goes, okay, I don't really have to look for any of those things, and I can pump out a render pretty quickly. So the next thing we need to do is obviously enable Freestyle. Now, line thickness mode can be set to absolute. You can sort of play around with relative, but let's just leave it at default settings so that nothing too complex has to occur. Under film, however, transparency should definitely be ticked. This will give us an alpha channel on the line work, allowing us to composite line work over any colors or images that we have. Okay, so that's everything for our scene settings. Now, under your output, you can leave your resolution to whatever you want. Your frame rate, because we're rendering stills, can be set to, you don't really need to tinker with any of that. And so let's then go down to our view layer. And this is where we set up our line set passes and all that sort of stuff. And I'm going to take you through a few of the settings that we need. Obviously, if you're in 2.8, view layer used for rendering should be ticked. I'll just bypass the freestyle for a second to jump into filter, which is very, very important. Now, by default, everything will be ticked. Now, because we're only rendering freestyle, we don't need an environment pass or to even render surfaces, hair, or ambient occlusion. All we need enabled is freestyle. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at freestyle itself. With freestyle enabled, these freestyle components, these little dialog boxes, now become active. What we have is the first one that just says freestyle, and it tells us what the control mode or the draw mode is, okay? And it gives us a few options. One of the most important is the crease angle, which is set to a default here, which basically means that anything, I think, above this crease angle doesn't render a line. So play around with that if you're feeling dissatisfied with how your lines are showing up. Culling is important because basically anything outside the view, so anything out here or behind or anything like that, is disregarded, which means you get a faster render. So that's important. Now, one final thing, under advanced objects, if you have any spherical objects or round objects, human characters, organics, it's a good idea to take a look at this. Bumping up your sphere radius to 1 generally can give you a better result, but for now, because in this particular scene everything is straight edges, we won't need that. So let's close that box now. Now here, Freestyle line set. This should be treated much like your material slot, or in Grease Pencil, if you're using 2.80, your layers, okay? So we're just going to play with one line set for today. A selection by visibility just means that everything that is viewed. Edge types, so obviously these are the edge types down here that you're ticking. Face marks, collection, and image border are all options as well. And you can see that face marks and collection are not enabled, okay? For a very particular reason. Now, collection is groups in 2.79, okay? That's the only point of difference here. And what this means is that you can select a particular collection to render a particular line set and then have a different collection with a different line set altogether. So visibility I won't really go into, but obviously we want everything that is visible on screen to render and not hidden things. QI range is where you get into a little bit of complex, where you have to basically tell it where to start and where to end. But for now, let's just leave it at the default visible and move down to edge types. Okay, so it's sort of like, you've seen logical or, logical and, inclusive, exclusive, sort of in Boolean operations before. And so it's one way to think about it. But basically, what we want to include here should be ticked, and that is the silhouette of objects, the border around objects. Contour can be ticked, as well as suggestive and ridge and valley, and you should play around with these to see what you get. But ridges and valleys is a tick box more for like organic shapes or round objects, and that's where you should definitely look at your advanced options and play around with your sphere and KR. Okay, now logical OR means that it will either look at the silhouette of the object or the crease in the object. Logical AND just means that it will do both. Edge mark, you can actually select an object. Let's select one here and go into, say, an edit mode, right? And in your edge to contextual menu, you can actually mark a freestyle edge, which means that it will render a line that is not dependent on contour or silhouette or anything like that, but rather dependent on whether that line has been marked or not. And that can come in very handy for some particular uses, but let's not tick that for now, okay? As well as a couple of other things like, say, material boundary. So if you've got one object with two types of material, you can get a freestyle edge right at that boundary, so it delineates one material from the other. Okay, so that's about it for line set, okay? And so I'm going to leave everything at default for a second. And finally, we have line style. And under this heading, we have a few options. Now, the strokes are basically each of the lines that are created. And I won't get into all of these options, but you've sort of seen them before, especially if you come from an Illustrator environment. Now, the color is fairly straightforward. You can have a base color of whatever you wish. I'm going to leave it black for now. Alpha, similarly, is how transparent those lines are. Now, the thickness is what we're going to have a look at in this tutorial, so I'll circle back to this. Geometry is basically how much geometry it samples, and I generally like to have this bumped up fairly high. Okay, and finally, texture is something that I don't generally look at, but you can actually create a texture that gets mapped onto your line work which can come in handy in some instances. All right, so why don't we do a render and let's see what we get. So I'm going to go ahead and do this render. It'll be a couple of minutes, so bear with me, I'll cut back. And here is our render. Doesn't look great, okay? And we can already see that we have an alpha over, but if you haven't got it set to that, you're probably going to get black. So what you want to do is go to color and alpha, okay? And then you'll see the alpha channel. But I'm going to give you a quick compositing tip to get a better looking render straight out the gate. So let's just open up our compositing window. I'm going to make one here, and I'm going to activate use nodes. For some reason mine haven't shown up, so I'm going to add a render layer. I'm going to add a composite output, and I'm going to attach the image output from my render layer to the image input of my composite output, which will give us the same thing. But now I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to go Shift A, and I'm going to, under color, go to mix. Going to place a mix node in here. Going to make sure that the image is on the second input of the mix node. And I'm going to enable the alpha of the second input in this operation. And now what we've got here is a very simple compositing setup. Your render layer, which is the Freestyle out, going through a mix node in which the first input is just a color, and then the mix is basically the Freestyle lines over the white. Now, it's looking okay. Everything is the same width, and what we want to do is refine it. So let's go back to our original, okay? And you'll see here that we actually have some thinner lines at the back and fatter lines at the front. And so I'm going to show you how to achieve this using a simple modifier on the thickness. Now, modifiers work anywhere on the line style, so let's go over them right now. Just going to open this up slightly so you're going to actually see my behind the scenes window here, which maybe we might just put into something that is less obtrusive. All right. And okay, so let's take a look at line style. Under thickness, you can see that the thickness, because we'd set it under Freestyle here to absolute, it means that the line thickness is set to 3. Okay, that's the base thickness. Base thickness is the center. So wherever it draws the line, that's where it centers it, and then it draws the thickness either side of that. If you set it to inside, this is sometimes better for compositing over renders with color information because it sets it inside the silhouettes of all the objects. Outside does the opposite of that. And then relative is one that I barely use, but basically they're shifted by any user-defined ratio. But let's just leave it on centered for now. We're going to add a modifier. Now, there's a couple that I like to use, but the one that I find the most useful is distance from camera. Now, this is a tricky one to use, so I'm going to take you through some of the caveats with this and why it's a little bit backwards in areas, but I'll try to explain why it is as best I can. So I'm going to click on distance from camera. Already, under this modifier, we've got a few parameters. We've got the influence, which means how much this particular operation is influencing the mixing or the multiplying or what have you with the baseline thickness. We've got the style of mapping. In this case, by default, it's linear. The range, the minimum range in meters, because I'm in the metric system and my units for this particular file is in meters, and the range of maximum, which basically means the minimum range from your camera plate and the value minimum, which is how thin or thick the line is going to be. In this case, it's going to be 0. And the value max, the range of the max, is set to 1. Okay, and this isn't what we want. Okay, we want the reverse of this, but rather than make the value minimum large and the value maximum small, I'm going to show you a neat trick which gives you a lot more control and is a lot more visual. Okay, now first off, how about this range? Well, to see how we're working, we need to go back into 3D space. I'm going to go into top view where we can see all of our objects. Now, each of these squares on the screen, the big squares, is 1 meter. So this isn't a hugely accurate scale model. But what we need to know is that the camera is over here and the last bit of model is over here. So we count roughly how much from the camera to the end that we want our range maximum to be. So let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then some, 8 and change. But I'm going to put 8 because it's inside that maximum. So anything beyond that will retain the consistency of that line thickness. So I'm going to make my range maximum 8 meters. Okay. And so our value minimum will be 0. And so the further, basically what we're trying to set up is the further away from the camera we are, the thinner the line until it peters out to 0. That's not always optimal. So I'm going to bump this up to maybe 0.15. And our value maximum, I'll leave it at 1 because I'm going to set our blend mode to multiply. So the value maximum will multiply what the base thickness is with this figure. And so 1 is going to be it. Now, how do you make it visual? Well, we switch it from linear to curve. And what we see here is that we have this curve that goes from 0 to 1, okay? But what we want is for the range to be reversed. So we're going to grab this and we're going to make that 1, and we're going to bring this down to 0. So the curve is backwards, as it were. So basically, because our range minimum is 0, that means it's 0 meters away from the camera, okay? And by default, the value minimum is set to the smallest number. We don't want that. We want the smallest number to be the furthest away. And so this goes from closest to the camera to furthest away from the camera along the curve. And so now what we've done is we've reversed the curve. So now that the value minimum will be reflected over here rather than over here. And so we'll go back to our camera settings. We'll do a fresh render, and then I'll be back after the render and I'll show you what the difference is actually going to be. And here is the render. And you can see that, yes, indeed, we've got some thinner lines up the back, and it sort of like brings it forward, and it's not great, but it is a start. And so this is where we begin to sort of tweak and re-render and tweak and re-render, and eventually you get the kind of result like this one that I prepared earlier, where if you change the curve, okay, and then we take a look at, you know, what a good value minimum and maximum is, what a base thickness is, all that sort of stuff, you get some really, really good results, okay? And that's the good and the bad of freestyle. You tinker and you tinker and you tinker until you get the result that you want. But it takes a lot of time re-rendering and re-rendering, because each of these renders is taking me about 3.5 minutes on my particular machine. So getting the right thing takes a little bit of experience, but once you're there, here is basically the result. And one of the advantages of this is that if you just want some flat color, there's a lot of things you can do with that flat color. For instance, you can have any kind of background color that you wish, so you can get some nice little monochrome things going. You can play around with the transparency. And now, of course, modifiers, much like anywhere else in Blender, can be stacked and improved on by adding a few more. And so what I've done here is our distance from camera modifier, okay, is set to multiply. And I've created this curve so that the minimum to maximum actually degrades at a much more organic rate, all right? But I've done one more thing. Before the distance of camera modifier, I've actually added an along stroke modifier. And what this does, if you take a look, is it tapers the edges of each stroke. Okay, so along this curve, it goes 0 to almost 1 to 0, and it will sort of make it look much more like an organic inking stroke. And by putting this first it applies this modifier, making all those strokes look organic, and then it applies the distance from camera modifier, making the foreground ones much thicker and the background ones much thinner. Okay, and so this is the way that you use Freestyle. Okay, it's a slow process. This render took about 3.5 minutes, and so inside of all that tinkering, you're going to be tinkering, rendering, and that's the one caveat to Freestyle. It's not a real-time effect, it's a post effect, and it does take a lot of time. But you can save your line styles. Okay, we can call this something, and import them or import them into other files. So once you've done the legwork in one, you like what it looks like, you bring it into another file, and you're good to go. So a lot of the work can be saved that way. But that's all I've got for this tutorial. I'll be doing a follow-up tutorial next month, which will take this file and improve on it just a little bit more. We're going to learn how to use some very basic shaders, again at a very low sample rate, to create some shadow information and some emission information. And it is all dependent on the compositor and post techniques to get those comic style toon effects. Now these files, the working file and this final file, are both available in a link below this video. If you're watching it on YouTube, just click on that link. It'll take you to the Patreon post where this is freely available. If you're on Patreon, you've most likely gotten this file already a week ago. But that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. If you're so inclined and you like seeing what's available here on YouTube, do subscribe to the channel. More stuff is coming up in the coming weeks, which I think you'll find very useful. And if you're feeling at all generous, support on Patreon is always very welcome. Those links at the end of the video. Thanks, guys. Bye for now.